Hey everybody, welcome to week 2. I hope you're enjoying the class so far. I'm really excited to get into our first sport, which is baseball. Now, growing up as the son of immigrants, I knew very early in my life, based on what was going on in my neighborhood full of kids, that baseball was an important sport. But my brother and I, we always tried to get everyone else to play either street hockey or soccer because we just weren't very good at baseball. We didn't ever played Little League, and it wasn't something that we ever consumed at home. But there was always that battle in the neighborhood of, are we going to play either roller hockey or soccer or football? And baseball was always our least favorite. Since then, as a historian of Latin America, I've come to a much more profound appreciation of the game itself as something that I enjoy watching and following, though not as rapidly as, say, hockey or soccer in my life, but as a really important sport that has shaped identities, lives, politics in the region that I study. So I'm really excited to talk with you all and move through this content with you all about America's pastime, baseball. So let's jump right into our task for this video, which is to contextualize the readings and to give you a sense of what I'm looking for as we move through the 4 authors that we have this week. First, let's take a little look at some great baseball footage that I found at the British Movie Toon archives that's been put up on YouTube by the AP.
Teams from 5 states at Sydney's Petersham Oval to contest the Claxton Shield in the Australian Baseball Championships. New South Wales, 9-time winners of the Shield, clash with traditional rivals and 6-time winners Victoria. Pitcher Creer and catcher Cantwell, the New South Wales battery, are effective. Victoria take advantage of their opponents' few fielding errors with sharp base running. In an extremely close game, Victorian pitcher Ken Stevens is the pivot of his side, his fielding and throwing being a constant menace to New South Wales. And you're out too. The match goes beyond the 9th innings and still no run has been scored by either side. Alan Kenny charges at the base and appears upset when he's given out, as New South Wales struggles to avert defeat. In the marathon 12th innings, Victoria's safe hitting and speedy base running gains them a 1-0 victory.
Thousands gathered in Havana to celebrate the rebellion which overthrew the Batista regime and to acclaim its leader, Dr. Castro, who began the struggle 6 years ago. Crowds of farm workers came into Cuba's capital to swell the throng. At a benefit baseball game, Dr. Castro played pitcher. This was soon after he threatened to resign the premiership. He'd been implored to remain in office. In fact, Cuba begged him to stay in there pitching. He certainly put on weight since he came out of the mountains, and if anything, his popularity too has increased. At a workers' convention, they kept up the pressure, urging him to carry on as prime minister. It's obvious they wanted him as their man in Havana. The personality which has captivated the Cuban people comes across vividly in these pictures. Castro lights up, obviously a man who supports Havana home industries. He's also decided to support the government by returning as premier. The scene is at the White City, the occasion a baseball match, as anyone might guess from a glance at the spectators. Hot dogs, peanuts, and other things dear to American fans were very much in evidence. Lord Tedder was there. Why? Because the Ruislip Rockets, a team drawn from the American Air Force, were playing the RAF. It was he, in fact, who started the ball rolling, and here's a glimpse of the RAF batting. It may be surprising to find the RAF playing baseball, but as a matter of fact, they can raise a pretty hot team. They're not so hot yet, however, as the Ruislip Rockets, who eventually won 12-4. I don't know whether they play cricket, but if not, they should certainly take it up.
So really cool things. We see some just great old baseball footage, but also one of the arguments that I've been making in this class, which is to understand sports in the United States, we have to look at sports and the United States. We have to take an international perspective, and then we see baseball as a presence in Britain, either before or during World War II or after World War II. I'm not sure of the dates on that, but it's the U.S. Air Force playing with the Royal Air Force. And you see baseball in Australia, which is something I bet you didn't think you'd be learning about in this class, but you see a match there, I think, between New South Wales and a team in Sydney. And then Fidel Castro playing baseball. And this is one of the great things that we get into in the readings this week, which is how can a sport that's so closely identified with the United States be taken up as such a strong symbol of identity in the Caribbean and in Central Latin America as a whole, really, as an expression of anti-colonial sentiment, as a cultural expression of something that is tied to a deeply Latin American identity, and depending on the nation we're talking about in the Caribbean. So let's start off by talking about Gutman. So here we have Games and Empires again. This chapter on baseball, it's a great way to start off the week because what really Gutman is talking about is the United States, its presence in the world as an exporter of modernity, and baseball being one of these cultural expressions that really was so closely tied to modernity in the United States, but also what was happening with modernity in the United States so quickly and so intensely, which is industrialization, urbanization, the compression of space and time, themes that we're going to get to both in Gutman and in Klein. And while we get a little bit into history and the kind of invention, the literal invention of baseball and its founding myth as an American game, supposedly by Abner Doubleday, but really an invention of Spalding to make it seem like a part of the nation's identity, we then jump quickly into Japan, which is another place I bet you thought we wouldn't go so close to at the start of the class. But since we're looking at a book that's really about the diffusion of sports, we see Japan as one of these great examples of a place that embraced baseball, not because of some, as Gutman puts it, some kind of alignment with supposedly traditional Japanese values, but for the exact opposite reason, because it was a force of modernity that was associated with a place of modernity, and that it doesn't arrive during World War II or in the occupation of Japanese islands after World War II, but that it has a long trajectory, the Meiji Restoration as a symbol of a changing Japan, right? And so we then go on to Caribbean baseball, a place that's within the sphere of U.S. imperial power, and really, like we were talking about with Castro, a game that quickly becomes something that from the upper classes that's transmitted from the United States to local elites start clubs, and then it filters down to a more popular level and a working class level, which is where that mix of games, cultural expression get tied up with identity in really strong ways. So strong that in a very short period of time you see baseball meaning something that can be anti-United States, and that while it may have been inherited from the United States is an expression of anti-imperial sentiment, right? The great stuff about this Gutman reading too is the sheer scale and weight of the leagues that are founded, especially in the Dominican Republic under Trujillo. We see some of America's, from the United States' best players being brought, being lured away from baseball in the United States to play in the Dominican Republic. And we'll go back to the Dominican Republic when we get to the Klein reading. Finally, the Australian example, again, as more recent example, but you see there Gutman drawing some distinctions between cricket, a very popular game in Australia, but kind of its hyper-commercialized current state being used as a way to sell baseball as something almost a little bit more of a return to playing a game for the game's sake, sport for sport's sake, right? So the Gutman reading, again, I think it gets us in a good frame of mind to think about the course's themes of space and money. You know, how is the space of an early globalizing world that you see the British and United States as spheres of influence competing, how baseball fits into that narrative, and then we get into Rice with money. So the two readings from our author Rice, the reading from Seymour is about the creation of the National League, and then Teigel's chapter is on Jackie Robinson. So what I want you to pay particular attention to in the Seymour reading is this setting of the late 19th century and what Seymour gives us a sense of as the wider economic and cultural changes that are happening to enable the sophistication of baseball as a money-making enterprise, and the vision of one person he really focuses in on, but the vision of businessmen and club owners to make baseball bigger, better, and more lucrative for themselves. And so think about what Seymour is contextualizing this story with in terms of urbanization and industrialization, and also think about the role of Holder, but what are the structures that Holder can use to consolidate the league, to kind of poach teams from the association and create this National League, and how the structures of that National League in terms of controlling players, controlling clubs, the one city, one team model, what else is happening in the country in order to enable that and make those good money-making ideas, right? Something to look forward to in the Seymour reading is what Seymour describes as the undemocratic character of the structures that Hulbert's forming the National League around. So pick out some examples of what that undemocratic character looks like. And then think about what Seymour is arguing about competition and monopoly. I might even describe it as competition within monopoly, right? Because it's the creation of a controlled product, right? That monopoly that the National League is aiming to create that needs the competitive element, which is why they're drawing the best teams, the most profitable teams to thrive within. So this notion of competition within monopoly is going to be important, and we'll look at it in other examples in the class. The Teigel reading is really interesting because some of you may know about Jackie Robinson, may have even read about Jackie Robinson before, but I think Teigel takes a story that's familiar to many of us and puts that story within, of course, wider changes that are happening around racial attitudes in the United States, but it takes that myth and explains it in a way that tells us something about how we want to remember that period of United States history as well. So what I mean by that is look for where Teigel is talking about why the narrative of Jackie Robinson and the arrival in baseball of this heroic figure as a transformative moment for race relations, as a moment of integration, why in some ways that is not the whole story, right? It is a bit of a myth, and it elides some of the continued racial tensions that Jackie Robinson isn't kind of changing overnight, right? But why that story has carried such a weight in narratives about the progressive nature of change and the integration that sport can sometimes be a stage for. And also just think about what are the pitfalls and limits of the Jackie Robinson story, and keep those in mind as we move throughout the rest of the class, because they're going to come up again and again. The Kahn reading is great. I really love this book, and what I really like about this chapter is it sets out for us the incredible popularity of softball. So we've learned a little bit about baseball's history in the other readings, but the popularity of softball in the 1930s and 40s is something that's invented and then very quickly becomes a very popular sport for people of all ages, all classes, a really inclusive sport because of its sort of ease of playing and the places that it becomes popular. I like how Kahn lays out that story for us on how popular softball is, but also in laying out why women particularly embraced the practice of softball and the kind of identity that they created within softball and the lifestyle that came with softball, especially as it became really successful in small town teams that would do all kinds of, extensive touring and had fairly stable lives as clubs. And then the masculine shift that happens within softball. We don't get to read too much about it, but it is very interesting for Kahn to lay out for us how quickly something that was seen as for all becomes more associated with working class masculinity and therefore has to push out and has to create a culture of the game that is more exclusive, even though it doesn't successfully work, obviously, seeing the state of softball today, right? But it is a very interesting quick shift that Kahn identifies for us. And then the All-American Girls Baseball League. Some of you are going to be watching A League of Their Own with Tom Hanks and Madonna and Rosie O'Donnell, and this movie is about the creation of that league and the life of that league. And Kahn gives us a really great sense of how incredibly successful this league was, and the National Girls Baseball League as an alternative that had different values and a different way of selling itself. And we really see how the All-American Girls Baseball League embraced the femininity, the supposed femininity of the game within a masculine space, right? It's that women can be women in what is not going to be argued a masculine space, whereas the National Girls Baseball League takes the attitude that the sexuality, the femininity, the appropriate gendered norms around their players is not what they're going to market the league around, and not something they're going to be particularly worried about. And it's a crucial difference to have kind of the All-American and the National as two different models for women's baseball. And I really want you to pay particular attention to the femininity principle and how the league organizers and commissioner coaches would police the boundaries of that femininity principle, and to focus in on things like the charm school, the criteria for players to have both the ability and appearance necessary, and how this really gets at, and it's an illustration of white middle-class femininity because there was never any black players in the All-American Girls Baseball League. So it's a great example of honing in on one particular kind of gender dimension of sport that has commercial success, but also has this other league with the National Girls Baseball League with its own kinds of successes, right? And then finally, it's a great chapter to take a look at player perspectives. There's a number of interviews that either Kahn conducted or she's referencing there. They give us a sense of what these women thought about playing baseball and what kinds of experiences they had and what kinds of lives that allowed them to live. And finally, that ultimate point of why baseball and softball, kind of the baseball leagues fall away and softball continues its trajectory as a successful women's sport. Kahn has an argument there about the inability of baseball to connect to the pool of talent that was being grown in softball. That's important for us as well. Finally, we have Alan Klein's book. Let me get this bad boy out. Growing the Game. Great book. I'm sorry that we won't get to read the rest of it because I suspect it's going to take all the baseball buffs to places that they really want to learn about. But if you are interested in going beyond the introduction in the first chapter that we read, it's Growing the Game. Fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And you'll learn really interesting things about specific teams, especially the Royals and the other team that's focused on it, of course, is the Dodgers. So yeah, highly recommend this book if you want to keep learning about the themes that Klein's talking about. But for the purposes of our class, I want you to focus in on the MLB International, the MLBI, as baseball's effort to globalize and to remain commercially viable, right? Because the introduction and first chapter are really laying out the reality that even despite lulls and periods of recovery that were happening at the time that Klein wrote the book in 2004, even with good ratings and parody and dramatic stories that were coming out, this is right about the time when Moneyball is making its big splash as well, and the kind of system that Billy Beane was implementing at the Oakland A's. The overall argument of Klein is that in order for baseball to survive, it has to expand globally and in dramatic ways. And he gives us a story about how the MLB is trying to do this through a specific through a specific arm, the MLB International. So in telling us his story, he also has some things to say about globalization, right? Globalization is not just seeing MLB players from Dominican Republic and Japan. You know, it's about more than having players with the last name of Ichiro or Guerrero in the MLB. It's also about places where baseball is going, not just the MLB as the place of globalization. So where are the commercial arms of the MLB taking the game? And where does the merchandising get produced? Questions like these are the one that Klein explores in the book. And the thing I think he really does a really good job of is that he clearly identifies what the crisis at the core is, the chapter title for the first chapter. And you should be taking notes as you move through that on what specific kinds of arguments he has to make about what's wrong, what is rotten at the core, right? And race is a central component of this, especially when we get into African American demographics of consuming baseball and playing baseball. So pay particular attention to those kinds of points as you move through that reading. Which pretty much wraps up what I want you to be looking for in the readings this week. But a word on the 4 course themes that we're going to be returning to throughout the semester: space, race, gender, and money. On the question of space, space really comes through in these readings in a couple different places. It's the space of globalization. It's kind of the planetary space and scale that we're looking at of how baseball moves across the world. But it's also about, again, cities, right? And there's a story of baseball outside of the cities that we're not going to get to in this class, in rural areas and in small towns. But we also see industrialization and urbanization in the city as the epicenter of large market teams, especially, as being kind of significant things that shape early baseball and baseball today. On race, it's something that I want you to pay attention to in this week beyond the Jackie Robinson story, right? And Klein gets into it, of course, but where does the question of exclusion and integration in a racial sense fall into the story of baseball? And the same thing a little bit with gender, about exclusion and inclusion, and especially changing norms and attitudes. I think we get a lot more on this in gender this week. So what I want you to hone in on is kind of the pretty amazing and poorly understood by kind of a wide public understood story of how long women have been active practitioners in the games of baseball and softball, and how, as one other political scientist has put it, Jennifer Ring has written a book about women in baseball, how women really had to be forcefully excluded from the sport because of the periods of success that women have found in baseball, not just in the All-American Girls Baseball League, but in kind of more grassroots sports organizations and clubs, and kind of the more unwritten histories of women just always being around the sand lots that young women and young men, boys and girls, were learning how to play the game on. So the final course theme of, well, before I move on to money, There's a really great point that Khan makes that we're going to return to in other points of this class, which is she describes a trap that the All-American Girls Baseball League fell into, and that is the trap of promoting the very gender distinctions that contradicted women's athletic ability, right? So accepting the premise that women were not supposed to be in the male sphere of baseball is the trap that Khan is saying the All-American Girls Baseball League fell into. They accepted the premise, first off, that it was a masculine space and said, it's actually kind of part of the novel appeal of this is the sexually desirable, the kind of girl next door that is falling within these prescriptive gendered norms can succeed in a masculine space, but it is still a masculine space, right? And that's kind of the novelty that the league was sold on. There's something deeply problematic about that Khan is pointing out for us that I think still has parallels. I think a really great example today is women's lingerie leagues for American football. You know, it's a place where we really see explicitly, you know, if we put women in lingerie to play a masculine sport, maybe people will watch it, right? The premise accepted there being that first comes sexual desirability as the premise upon which the practice of a masculine sport can be practiced, right? And it's something that we're going to return to at other points in the class. The final concept that we're paying attention to, money. This really comes across in the Seymour reading and in Klein's book. So I want you to pay attention to what kind of business practices make the National League successful and make somebody like Hulbert successful at creating the National League and making money from it, and what kinds of financial challenges are facing an organization like the MLB today. And not just the MLB, but commercialized sports, period, because there's a point that Klein is making there about how tough it is to compete with other forms of entertainment, period, that all kind of highly commercialized professional sports have to reckon with today. Now, the final point I want to make to you is about the weekly writing question. So let's read it off here. How did baseball become so popular in the United States and abroad? And in your answer, be sure to touch on the ways that baseball's history illustrates changing notions of race and gender. So I want you to lay out for me what you've learned about the history of baseball, right? So why did it become popular in the United States and why did it become popular abroad? But then as you're answering that question, at specific points when you explain the history that you've learned about, tell me about what kinds of integration and exclusion are going on, what kinds of challenges to attitudes about race and gender are being made, and what kinds of clamping down on attitudes about gender and race are being displayed in baseball's history. So as long as you're touching on all the readings and you're explaining the history of baseball and you're telling me about race and gender's role in that history, you're going to do well in the response. There will be some other instructions on what else is coming up in the week in terms of the film review, and I'll also be recording another video that gives you feedback on your weekly writing prompts from last week. So please email me if you have any questions about the week's content. Good luck with the readings, and I hope especially all the big baseball fans enjoy this week, and feel free to contact me about anything you're particularly interested in or have questions about if you really love the game.